I think there are three. It's a win-win-win-lose proposition. The U.S. won. We can talk about why and how. The Emiratis won, why and how, and clearly the Israelis won. The loser in all this clearly is the Palestinian National Movement, who's been marginalized and virtually ignored as Arab states begin to consider normalization with Israel without much progress on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the loser here then. Where does this leave the Palestinians? What does this mean for the Palestinians going forward?
I mean, I think it's clear that they remain the weakest, most divided party. Their options are very bleak. Military struggle, armed struggle is not an option. A negotiation under the terms being offered by the Trump administration, by the government of Israel, not an option. And there's a good measure of drift. Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, has been discredited. His popularity is sagging. Hamas remains isolated and boxed in by the Israelis. And it seems to me we're stuck, Robin, in a space between a two-state solution that's too important to abandon on one hand, but too difficult to implement on the other. And I'm afraid varying degrees of dysfunction and violence and perhaps periods of calm, that's where we're going to remain for quite some time.
You say the UAE is a winner here, but have potentially Israel and the US outplayed the UAE here? I mean, this is a major victory for them, but for only a promise of a return.
Well, first of all, you know, the proof obviously is in the proverbial pudding. If in fact annexation is suspended, the UAE can rightfully claim that they have been a kind of redeemer of the two-state solution and a proponent in favor of the Palestinian cause. And remember, the UAE reads the polls in Washington as well, and they see Donald Trump's fortune sagging, so they're hedging their bets. They've picked up kudos in the Trump administration through this move, on one hand, and they've positioned themselves, should Joe Biden become president, to be a pretty significant and potentially important partner for his administration. They're trying to separate themselves from the Saudis, whose reputation in Washington, at least in a Biden administration, is going to be pretty poor. And like many Arab states, beginning with Sadat, they understand that the road to Washington lies through Jerusalem.
Where do you see other states after this following, potentially?
Well, I think you've asked a critically important question. I mean, there are a handful of possibilities, and there are ones that I would exclude. I think there's a real possibility that the Omanis, although Qaboos is no longer the head of state, and it may take some time for them to adjust, the Omanis become a possible successor for normalization. The Bahrainis do, with the acquiescence of the Saudis. The big prize, of course, is Saudi Arabia. And I don't think there's any way to bet with any certainty that the Saudis will follow anytime soon. Mohammed bin Salman still has very little room to maneuver, given Saudi Arabia's prestige in the Arab world and the constraints, traditional constraints, under which the Saudis operate on the Palestinian issue. So if you get traction, if you get the Bahrainis and the Omanis, and perhaps even the Qataris, although that's a more complicated situation, you're going to end up with a pretty heavy weight with respect to normalization with the Israelis, which will reinforce the message to the Palestinians that their fears and suspicions of Arab abandonment are proven to be all too real.
Aaron David Miller, thank you very much. Always very good to get your perspective.
Thanks so much, Robin. Take care.
You too.